Hello and welcome everyone to our next up MTI Live. Really excited today to be joined by four fantastic panelists to talk to you guys about manufacturing medtech, so medical devices and diagnostic technologies. How do you bring these all the way from, an initial product concept all the way to a final product, and all of these stages in between that you have to consider, like supply chain, working with CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, and how do you consider things like quality and documentation as you're working your way through this process? So really excited to be joined today by Carolyn Spargarin, who's a director at Rev1 Engineering and has held many different positions there that she'll talk to you about. Adam Alexander, who's an R&D manager at Hologic. Adam Wentworth, who is a senior product development engineer at Rico 3D. And last but not least, Sonia Patel, who's an applications engineer at Inkbit. So really excited to hear from these amazing panelists. So we'll first kick it off by hearing from each of them and some of their background and context in the manufacturing space. So Carolyn, I'd love to start off with you and hear a bit about your background and experiences. Oh, sorry, Carolyn, you got to unmute. There you go.
Carolyn Spagarin. I'm currently a director for PMO for Rep1. I've been in the medical device industry for about 30 plus years, and I've held various positions from manufacturing, quality, R&D, and program management. Started my career at Guidant. I was there for 18 years. Then I moved on and gained some experience working for a component supplier and stayed there for about 5 years. Joined their quality team, then eventually introduced and implemented clean room manufacturing for them. Then after 5 years, I left, went back to Guidant. That was out of state, so I moved back to California, again working for Guidant, which transitioned at that point to Abbott Vascular. Stayed there for 5 years where I managed site transfers and also moving manufacturing into Puerto Rico, managed that project. Then I left after 5 years, went to Philips. I was there as working for in R&D, specifically sensor guide wires. And then I left Philips. The last position I held there was implementing business processes during the transition of Philips into Volcano. Actually, Philips was Volcano at that time. Then now I'm at Rev1, 2.5 years, managing their project management office.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Really great experiences you're bringing in. We're definitely going to ask you about clean rooms later as well, given your experience in that. So thank you for joining us today. Next up, we've got Adam Alexander.
Hi, everyone. Adam Alexander. I'm an R&D manager at Hologic. I support the surgical division out in our Colorado office. We're focused on advanced energy surgical devices. My background has been all in R&D in both new product development and product engineering or sustaining, holding a number of different R&D level roles through project management, and then now managing a technical team out here in Colorado. So excited to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Adam. I've got our second Adam, Adam Wentworth, joining us as well.
Hey, I'm Adam Wentworth, a senior product development engineer at Rico. My history is mostly in academia and 3D printing on the East Coast, moving between some academic labs, a little bit of teaching. I moved over to the Mayo Clinic a few years ago to produce some anatomic models and surgical guides while working at the clinic. And in the past few months, I've been working at Rico to develop new products and sort of scale patient-specific devices.
All right, thanks, Adam. Yeah, love to hear about your experiences with patient-specific devices. Definitely a hot topic in the medtech space. And then last, Sonia, I'd love to hear about your background.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I currently work at Inkbit, which is a startup in 3D printing that can print elastomers and rigid parts. I'm an applications engineer, so I do a lot of helping customers edit designs and print with our process. But I started my career at Stryker, also on the additive team, where I worked on implants and a lot of the medical device housings and things like that. So yeah, excited to be here.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we launch into questions, for those of you that are joining via LinkedIn, if you guys have any questions for our panelists, you can post them in the event description. Those will get sent to me. So I'll be sure to ask those during the live portion that we have here. For our cohort listening in, if you guys have questions, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom. You guys know the drill by now. So really looking forward to hearing some of those questions that you guys are going to share. And so, yeah, without further ado, we'll kick this off. So the first thing that I want to know about, this is all about manufacturing, and we know that manufacturing can take many different forms with many different, types of equipment and processes. So I want to know, what types of manufacturing processes each of you have worked with. And alongside that, do you see any of these particular methods having increased or decreased usage in medical device manufacturing in the coming years? So Carolyn, we'll start with you for this one.
In terms of manufacturing processes, it's really it's a wide range, right? Because some of these medical devices are very specialized. So a lot of them are very manual, actually, and there's a lot that are automated. So those that are manual, obviously, it has its challenges in that thorough validations are usually is what we execute most of. And then in automation, a little bit sometimes easier, but not always, because there's governance around automation of some of these processes.
Yeah, a really good answer. So what I think I'm hearing is, maybe automation will take over for some of these manual processes in the future, but we need to get the technology to that stage. Awesome. Adam Alexander, what have you worked with in terms of processes?
Yeah, in R&D, there's a number of different ones that come to mind. Injection molding is an obvious choice for med device, but it takes a lot of different forms that I've seen. Plastics is the most common and well-known. Have done quite a bit of work beyond that with micro molding. So thinking about really small plastic parts with very unique material sets, that opens a lot of doors there. Something that's really taking off in our industry is metal injection molding and ceramic injection molding, both of which are kind of very similar to the plastics, but obviously different material selections and different ways of getting to a final part. And then in addition to that, just some very more common, more metal focused machining, stamping, coining, and then another unique process set would be medical coatings as well. So a number of different ways to coat a device for different outputs or in applications. So big gamut.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And next up are our two 3D printing experts. So I'm sure 3D printing will play a big role, but love to hear specifically, what in 3D printing, it's a broad term encompassing many different types. What have you worked with in this, and has there been anything else that you think is going to be popular in the coming years? Yeah, Adam.
So yeah, I think the most accessible 3D printing is, FDM and SLA technologies. So I think that's, straightforward and people have a lot of experience in there. While I was at Mayo, they had a wonderful benefit of being able to access some SLS machines were a little bit more expensive. Multi-jet fusion as well, because for the industry that we are in, it was a little bit more aesthetic, like you need multicolor parts. Doing binder jetting, which was, maybe a slightly older technology, a little less commonly used, but could offer some benefits in terms of different material selections or ceramic materials that you might want to use. And then also doing, while I was doing more of the early stage product development in Boston, combining 3D printing with some of these technologies like injection molding that offer you a little bit more consistency or flexibility in the materials that you can use. So we did kind of a really cool project of, molding 3D printed parts, but then using injection molding as a way to do really quick iteration and quick optimization of materials.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I love seeing, where 3D printing can interface with other manufacturing technologies. So the lab that I came out from, Jennifer Lewis's lab at Harvard, did a lot also with using 3D printers for pick and place of different components. So I think a lot of cool ways you can also think of utilizing that technology in the next dimension. So Sonia, what about you?
Yeah, so I'd say pretty much a similar answer. So any 3D printer I've probably worked with at this point. Um, Mostly when I was at Stryker, they were pretty industrial, and they're really known for the concept laser, which is a powder-based metal process. And a lot of those parts were in titanium because that they were printing implants. And then across, um, and then there's also like the plastic side, which has MJF, as Adam mentioned, and SLS is also another common one that a lot of companies are using for more on the medical side.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sonia. Awesome. So, we talked about prototyping. How do we start, coming up with what this product's going to look like once you have an idea? So, when you're thinking about moving forward in prototyping, often people want to know, what sorts of resources or tools are out there to even get started thinking about how you design a product. So, Adam W., what sort of resources, tools would you recommend to a startup?
For a startup company, I think maybe it's similar to the academic space where you're a little scrappy, trying to move really quick, you're trying to, get things out there. So I think, or test a lot. So my kind of like starter pack for prototyping is definitely to start looking, get ideas, look at file repositories like McMaster-Carr, GrabCAD library, Thingiverse, where you have like kind of ready 3D printable files or parts that you can, stock hardware parts that you can integrate with your designs. Um, Tools like Fusion that really bridge a lot of gaps of manufacturing are easily accessible, where you can do CAM operations, you can do 3D printing. Things where maybe a little less common if you want to do 3D scanning, getting into free tools like Mesh Mixer, things that can do on the more organic side. I don't know how many people are doing organic type of models, and maybe a little less common, but definitely on the patient specific side, you have to consider how do you manipulate organic models. um, and then from the hardware perspective, probably like FDM stuff, and um, you know a lot of like tools would be like dial calipers or laser cutters or Dremels, stuff like that, where you can really they're very flexible tools. You can do a lot with them and really touch all different parts of your process.
Yeah, great answer. Love all those suggestions. I put a few of the links in the chat if you want to add any other for anyone, Adam, that I'm sure they'd appreciate it, especially the cohort. I personally love Mesh Mixer. I used to use it all the time for creating porosity in parts and things like that. So really useful tool. Great. So, during the design and prototyping process, what type of work may be better to outsource to a contractor or outside firm rather than working on internally? So rather than, having one of your engineers like, on Mesh Mixer, like, CADing things up, what types of things might be better to outsource? Carolyn, what do you think? Sorry, I'm muted again.
Sorry. My experience is I think keep your core technology in-house and outsource those that take away resource and time that are better spent on your core technology, right? The upside of outside developer doing it all is that they will be around for a while to support you in the future. And also other consideration is that if you outsource some of this work, potentially it could be a lower overhead, and contract developers would have all the different skill sets. If you are thorough in your selection, then an outside developer may have all the different engineering disciplines that you would need. If you have a combination device, for example, you would have somebody who's an electrical engineer already available there. If it's software, you have a software engineer, mechanical engineers, even prototyping technicians, and even early manufacturing, right? If that's what you want to do. And for some contractors, you only pay for what you need at that time, right? Especially those that are time and material. So if you only need 20% of an electrical engineer, then that's what you get charged for. But I think
Really good advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked your point about, keeping core technologies in-house, and, a lot of our cohort, has a core technology, but maybe something supplemental like a delivery tool or, unique packaging mechanism, something to interface, with the body in a different way, things like that could be a good idea to outsource. And, as you said, find someone with that niche expertise and not have to pay them, full-time salary for that. So, keeping things in-house, and, we, clearly got a lot of expertise in 3D printing here. So, Adam and Sonia, you both have a background in this. How do you think 3D printing has evolved over the years? Is it still mainly being used for prototyping, or do you see a company starting to use it for end-use medical devices? So Sonia, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I've seen a big range. So since I started at Stryker, they're a huge company. They have tons of resources. They had the years to invest in getting like FDA approval for 3D printing. So for their implants specifically, it took around 20 years. But a lot of startups don't have that time. But I think it's great that larger companies kind of take that on, can inspire other companies to do the same. On the inkbit side for medical devices, I do see some potential. So we do have a lot of prototypes, but then there are companies that are willing to invest for the benefits of our process. But I think it's overall the biggest problem in 3D printing is the materials aren't always validated for medical use. But I see a lot of it being like tier one, not skin contact, but housings. I see a lot of things like that aren't touching patients yet. But there's roads. So maybe Adam has more to add on that.
Yeah, Adam, what do you think? Do you think it's mostly materials challenge, or are there other challenges, especially around patient matching, that you've seen from the FDA?
Yeah, I think the first medical and AM conference I went to 3 or 4 years ago, I saw some really interesting stats of, the progress, the trends of approved medical devices that have been additive manufactured, a pretty even split between polymer and metal, and just kind of an exponential growth of the number of devices per year that are approved. And what you see is people who have the resources to put that first device in really get followed with a lot of 510Ks, so other people can produce more devices, can produce better devices. And I think that's kind of a lesson to be learned from the first evolution of really desktop SLA and desktop FDM printers. Was accessibility was kind of the big kind of breakthrough, right? You saw Kickstarters yield Formlabs, unicorn company in less than 10 years, really incredible stuff. So making stuff accessible, I think, is one of the key parts of the evolution of printing. And the second thing is probably a materials explosion. You see it's really more of a focus on the applications, and those really demanding material properties. And so when you, especially the biomedical space, when you get the option to direct print materials that have those certifications, it just unlocks a lot of doors. So I'm excited to see both the accessibility and the materials development side, and of late, probably the past year, a lot of partnerships that are enabling folks without the expertise in a certain field to kind of go together, to not make it really a competition between companies, but to say we're still a small fish in a big pond for manufacturing and additive. Let's try to tackle it together.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I've seen a lot of these, collaborations between 3D printing companies spring up. So even, in the breast reconstruction space, a lot happening. One of our cohort companies, Lattice, is actually doing a 3D printed breast implant, but a lot of companies have dabbled in this and are, it's a big problem. So how do you get to that end goal? Great. So, we talked about prototyping a little bit. So, once you're getting to the phase where you're actually starting to develop your product and think about, how you might put it in a good state to be able to scale up for manufacturing, what are some important things that you should keep in mind when designing this product for manufacturing? Adam, Alexander, I'd love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to really have that plan and vision. That's the first thing. To really know how you're going to anticipate scaling up. So establishing a plan. And then with that said, to say, early DFM with your suppliers is really important, especially in the prototype phase. So you are thinking about what manufacturing processes does this particular widget or device, lend itself to allow for. So if you're considering your prototypes and incorporating that DFM feedback, so you can easily transition to either the same process or something different that allows you to scale. Working close with your suppliers is important. And then beyond that, the collaboration with your operations and manufacturing partners within the project team is also critical. Making sure this is able to be built in a pretty efficient and robust way, and it's repeatable. So working closely with those team members is also important as you think about scaling. And then really the other thing would be simplifying your supply chain. Thinking about a product that has a number of different components that feed into it. If you're able to simplify some of your suppliers, that may make things a bit more efficient as you scale up, minimizing lead times and cost and things like that as you look at high volumes. And then speaking of volumes, kind of the last point to hit on here is really making sure that you're gut checking your business case throughout product development. That's to say your volumes and COGS that you anticipate both at launch, and then your years 1 through 5 are typically scrutinized for scalability, just to make sure this still makes sense from a business case standpoint, that this product has legs and merit to prove itself in the market.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Really like that you brought up, thinking about COGS early on. This is something I think, a lot of our companies are very innovative and so often have, very unique materials or manufacturing processes that go into their device. But, think about at the end of the day, what this is going to take to cost, and if this is going to be practical for what they'll get reimbursed for, is really good to keep in mind. Great. So, during this whole process, as you're designing, in med devices, highly regulated fields, you're going to want to implement some design controls. So, Carolyn, love to hear from you. How do you approach implementing design controls? What even are these for a medical device? And, what are some, best practices you might use for developing a design history file? Oh, sorry, unmute. Sorry, Carolyn, can you unmute?
I mean, design controls really, there's governance out there, right? Specifically for medical, pharmaceutical. But at Rev1, how we do it is we approach it in the same phases, right? Concept and feasibility, design and development, design input, outputs. I think we spend a lot of time at Rev1. We spend and recommend spending a little bit more time in concept and feasibility, though sometimes startups or developers or smaller companies that have limited budget, this may be a bit of a challenge. But I think if you spend a little bit more time in concept and feasibility and de-risk the project, then it provides more certainty in the subsequent phases. And then, like Adam spoke to, then it's focused really on DFM. And having that overlap during design output, right? That you work with your manufacturers and you're designing for manufacturability. And often then, sometimes what I see is that people's companies spend time in doing phases siloed somewhat, but I think the true benefit is the interface or overlap between concept and feasibility, design development, and then design and development with manufacturing transfers. In terms of DHF, I think if we follow the QMS and position the structure the DHF so it aligns with your QMS and also the deliverables as each phase, I think it's easier to manage. I really love the manual DHF because it's easier to manage it during design and development, and it can easily transfer electronically if that's how one wants to manage their design history file. Best practice for me is putting all the risk management files in one location as it evolves continuously throughout development. And my experience with FDA audits is they immediately want to go look at your risk management file, and it's in one centralized location. It's easily accessible. They can, they look at what they need to see. And so I don't fumble around looking at the different phases in which I had produced some of those deliverables.
Thanks, Carolyn. Really, really great advice, especially around risk and especially for early stage startups, starting to think about, what are your risks for all people that are going to be in contact with this, the surgeons, the patients, and documenting that all to hopefully prevent that early in your design phase. Cheaper and easier than figuring that out later, for sure. So great. We've got, some fantastic, materials experts here and component experts. So these are, really the nuts and bolts that go into the med device. So, first of all, when choosing a material that is going to comprise part of your med device, how do its properties impact your decision? Are there any resources that you can use to make the best choices for material selection? Adam Wentworth, love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, so the FDA will say, the material, the biocompatibility, I would say, is like number one of most of the devices that we're producing, and that dictates a lot of material choice or the limitations, the biggest constraint on the choices of materials that you have. So it's important to consider whole device compatibility in its finished form. So it's, after everything is completed. When we started a company making these injection molded surgical masks, one of the things that we did was look at these service bureaus that can provide you with prototypes. And these folks are just full of knowledge as far as material choice and what kind of other devices are they used in. So we actually used a silicone that was based in like oxygen masks, right? So looking at other medical devices that have similar use cases or similar applications can kind of give you a little bit of a shortcut. There's a reason why people select specific materials, so it's better not to reinvent the wheel. A lot of these materials should have good documentation that you can lean on as well. As far as MSDSs, what class of polymer might they be in, and then your application. For biocompatibility specifically, you're going to look at what body tissues it contacts, how long. You may need to do you have to do some of your own testing for 10993 for whatever body tissues it's contacting. And aside from biocompatibility, then you're starting to look at specification sheets for things like strength, chemical compatibility, thermal properties, et cetera, right? Your application also dictates what disinfection you need to do for your device, and that's going to dictate what chemicals it might be exposed to. So I think early on, just to know that really the core details of your device, how it's used, kind of gives you a sense of what material properties are going to be required.
Yeah, so really broad, great answer to think about, and feeds really well into my next question, which you touched on, which is, sterilization, disinfection of your med devices. Carolyn, love to hear from you. What are some common sterilization methods being used for med devices, and are all of these compatible with all materials that you might use?
The most two common ones that I've worked with is ETO and E-beam, but obviously not all components are compatible. Certain things need to be considered. ETO penetration for assemblies, for example, if you have fluid in your device, things like that, obviously that's encapsulated and ETO cannot penetrate that. And also material degradation and discoloration with E-beam sometimes is an issue. Very thin polymers have issues with E-beam. So these need to be evaluated. It doesn't necessarily mean that these differences impact the integrity of your device. It just needs to be evaluated what impact it has. Like PTFE coating, for example, on guide wires, lubricity may be impacted, but when you do your comparison testing or where it's being used, does it really matter at that point, right? But the bottom line is just evaluate, your different sterilization processes.
Yeah, definitely something to think about early on is, that as well. And I know ethylene oxide has also had some challenges, from the EPA standpoint. So definitely something to consider the facilities could be shut down due to emissions, maybe, going for a benchtop unit or another thing instead, if possible. Good thing to consider. So, thinking a bit bigger beyond the materials up to, different components in it. What are some different challenges between designing a custom component that might go into your med device versus buying something off the shelf? Adam, Alexander, love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, some of the key considerations is lead time and costs, especially early on in your quick and dirty and concept development. Off the shelf obviously lends itself to fast and furious, and then more custom typically incurs a lead time and a cost consideration for investing in particular tooling and things needed to make it. I think as we look at scaling from prototypes to production, there's different manufacturing techniques. We all kind of alluded to the different ones we're familiar with, but certain ones lend themselves to be more adept to prototyping versus production. So considering the different processes based on the volumes and how many parts you're expecting to scale to are something to consider if you're thinking about, machining is common, 3D printing is common, and prototyping, and then more injection mold, more robust toolings, things like that as we scale up parts in high volumes. And then in addition to that, there's also different levels of tooling. Some tooling can lend itself to prototype phase, things like quick aluminum tools or mud bases and molding are often good solutions to kind of bridge you between that low volume phase and then high volume. And then thinking about just the quality control of your parts and kind of managing the supply chain is also important, making sure things are being well maintained and that you have a viable prototype and comparable to what we would be testing for production. Kind of that production intent, if you will, is what the FDA often looks for in your testing. So making sure you have the equivalence and the testing you're doing and making sure you're getting the right data off of the parts that you're evaluating. So all these considerations as we scale up to product development.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Really like that you touched on, 3D printing also as a method to start with, to consider, these custom components and how they might work with your device. We had a question submitted on LinkedIn, actually. So if you guys are listening from LinkedIn, be sure to submit your questions in the comments of the event. So someone was wondering, what if they are starting with 3D components and then want to switch to injection molded components for larger quantities? How do they manage that process, and what might be needed from a regulatory perspective for this? So maybe Sonia or Adam, one of you guys want to just take this?
Yeah, Adam? I can start. We did that for our injection molded mask, right? At the end of the day, we said, okay, this is going to be injection molded finally, but our first prototypes, just to get a form and fit and really understand, is this a good design? You want to start with 3D printing because it's cheap, right? So after you've kind of fleshed out a base design, we submitted to proto labs really early in COVID, and everything was slowing down, but it was really nice to have kind of that system give us a little bit of feedback on design as far as is it injection moldable? So those systems may be out there for you to, if you're not an injection molding expert, that you could submit a CAD file and get kind of a visual feedback of potential problem areas in a design that you might need to change, as well as then a follow-up, customer service call that you might be able to talk to really high-level experts that do a ton of injection molding, can give you even more tips. We didn't even need to design the actual mold. We could just give them a CAD part and they would do mold design and everything after that. So that's, I think, a good foray for folks that it may be a little daunting for them.
Yeah, it's really, really good advice that they can, take it all the way if you even just have that file. Sonia, you have anything to add to this? Different things to consider if you're making that transition?
Yeah, I think it kind of relates to the previous question where you're thinking about what you should do yourself versus what you can hire someone else to do. And injection molding has just been around for so long. There's so many experts that it's not, I think that's one of the things, it's not worth learning. It's already a solved problem. So I would agree with that.
Definitely we wouldn't recommend anyone buy injection molding injection molder for their own manufacturing facility. That's definitely something you can do. Create your own molds with them. Awesome. Thank you to whoever asked that question on LinkedIn. Really appreciate that. So, talking more about components and, there's so many different components that will end up going into your medical device. So Carolyn, how do you ensure traceability of all of these different components going into one med device?
I think earlier on during your development process, just implementing your lot history records and creating your material specification and implementing your change of management, right? So there's traceability to everything that you do from concept and feasibility, and mature that all the way through manufacturing. And also sometimes there's dual suppliers, keeping those segregated if it's a critical component, for example, being able to trace it back to where the part came from.
Yeah, great answer. Making sure, you've got good records of where these are all coming from and can trace them into one final device. Ideally, but probably not likely, your first product that you're starting to manufacture is gonna, be a success. But, maybe there's little things you'll realize either during clinical trials or maybe even during commercialization that you need to change, whether that's a component or a material composition in this. So Adam, Alexander, I'd love to hear, when might one of these substitutions need to be made? Can you share an example of why this might need to happen? And did the device have to go through regulatory approval again, or other impacts that might have happened because of this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that come to mind as to why a material change or substitution is needed. If I think about, design verification, often you'll see a test failure because of incorrect material choice as an example. You also could get post-market feedback. Once the device is commercialized, you may have field failures that you need to address. So maybe I'll use the example of a DV test failure. We're going through testing. You have a mechanical test, and you have a component that fails, and you do some root cause and identify that the material is not quite strong enough to withstand the loading conditions that the device is subject to. So you think about a material change, and you're looking at different materials, and you land on something that is a suitable replacement. I think there's kind of 4 key questions that need to be asked when making a material change. I think the first is, is this change truly a change in material type, the formulation, the chemical composition or processing? And then second, does this new material substitution really change or affect the performance specifications of the device? So making sure you're kind of looking at the design outputs that you're intended to meet and analyzing those. And then third would be a risk-based assessment, looking at the risk profile of the device. Does this new material introduce any new risks that weren't otherwise there in the product, and capturing those in your risk management file. And then fourth, we've kind of talked about, looking at similar marketed devices. This is material, a commonly used material in other products or a similar product family in a particular use case that's similar to the device that you're looking to verify. The FDA does have a really nice flow chart that you can find in their guidance documentation that is specific to a material change. So it kind of gives you a yes/no questionnaire, and you can kind of follow that to make a decision on whether or not a new 510K is needed, or often a letter to file is often appropriate, or just the internal re-verification and maintaining the DHF documentation is also in some cases appropriate, depending on where the product is in development. So a number of different pathways to take, but a lot of available resources out there depending on the situation that you may be in.
Oh, thanks, Adam. Super helpful. If you're able to dig up that link for, how to decide if a new 510K is needed, I'm sure The cohort would love that if you could put that in the chat. Seems like a really good resource. So, my next question about components is, a lot of times, especially startups don't really consider like the packaging, labeling as a component or something to prioritize, especially when they're, early in R&D. So Carolyn, when is the right time to start thinking about packaging and labeling? And do you need to consider designing these components sooner? And are there reasons like shipping, storage, possible, toxicity of these components?
It all depends on the complexity of the device, right? I would typically start the initial packaging concepts in concept and feasibility just to determine what are the risks and what are the additional work I may have to do to implement this packaging that I need to factor in my design work and resourcing. So sterilization method, like you mentioned, shipping and transportation, extreme condition, end user workflow, right? It's sometimes difficult to get that feedback. You open a package and you don't want your product falling on the floor, and sometimes we don't consider those type of things. Also, how they store them in the labs or in their workspace. Also, product returns. So, and the impact, some of the environmental impact for packaging. So, yeah, I would do it earlier on, and then and do the work up front. And sometimes the packaging can run in parallel. It also helps to do that up front, de-risk the project, because there's strategies in your design verification validation where you can marry your samples. You can be confident your packaging is robust. So in your design verification, aging, you can kill two birds with one stone, basically, in your testing.
I really would like that approach. And yeah, definitely, hadn't thought about the device falling on the floor because of the packaging being poorly designed. And so definitely, even like if you're doing early feasibility studies, making sure that you consider that and have, maybe some user needs that you analyze just around taking it out of the packaging, especially if it's a complex device. So great to know around that. Awesome. So want to move into now talking about suppliers. So how do we go about, identifying suppliers and forming agreements with them, once we've decided, what components are going into this. So when is the best time in the product life cycle to implement supplier agreements? So Adam Wentworth, maybe you could take this one.
I think I have a little less experience than the other panelists on this part, but at least from my experience, pretty early on, I think when you have kind of a final device shape, estimated volumes, when we were looking at contract manufacturers, that's one of the first things they ask us is estimated volumes, right? Is it worth for them to get involved with us based on the quantities we expect to produce? So I think, pretty early on, but you really have to know what your market is and you really have to know what volumes you expect before you get into it.
Yeah, really good to think about is, what if it's just going to be like a few devices for maybe a clinical study, or if this is, you're locking this in and you're going to start commercialization. You definitely want to make sure that, that company isn't going to go out of business or something soon. You have a robust agreement in place.
Yeah.
So
And can
Adam
they do
Alexander,
both?
yeah, love to hear from you on this too. And also, what should you look for in a potential supplier, and how much should you maybe prioritize local suppliers, things like that?
Yeah, some of the key things I think you should look for are the capabilities of the supplier. Do their capabilities and their manufacturing methods meet your product needs and what you're looking for? One of the really key things that I look for as an R&D team is a partnership. And so do they have the expertise and the engineering support to help facilitate the product development? I think it's important to collaborate with their team, and often a lot of these suppliers will have dedicated SMEs that are a really good partnership to help support and mature a design. So I think it's important to look for that. And then just scalability and fit. I think, often in product development, you're looking for somebody for production, but also you have prototyping, and it's really nice to find a supplier that's able to to kind of take you from cradle to grave, essentially, in product development. So finding a supplier that is able to offer some prototype options as well as support production, you know, if they're hands-on from start to finish, that's often the best case for you. So you don't have to look outwardly later in the development life cycle. And then just cost. I think it's important to start quoting early, just to assess your COGS for long term, looking at those volumes, looking at what their piece price parts might look like. And then do they fit, you know, what your business case is, and do you fit their business case and fit within what they're looking for? Then looking at local suppliers, I think, you know, there's a lot of advantages with a local supplier. Maybe lead time is faster, just given the proximity to where your development site may be. But one of the really big things that stand out for me as an opportunity is the on-site support and troubleshooting. So to get your team familiar with how they're making your parts, what's going into that, you can really be there hands-on, side by side with their team in a local site. So I think that's something that draws itself as an advantage to consider.
Love the cradle to grave idea. You know, that was a really good one. You know, how can you start with working with them just in small quantities, and then work your way up. So that's really helpful. So, you know, when thinking about suppliers as well, you know, how do you start to build resilience into your supply chain? So Carolyn, maybe you can touch on this, like, you know, is performing an audit sooner than later a good idea, or are there other things that you should look out for to make sure that this is going to be a stable supplier for you?
Yeah, that's sometimes it's a difficult one because we also have to consider, like Adam spoke to earlier, volumes, right? Or where we are in our development phase. So sometimes the difficulty with working with larger suppliers, although they have the capabilities, is lead times, right? If you are low volume, for example, sometimes it's difficult to work with the larger suppliers, right? So it's a phase approach sometimes in which you work with the suppliers that can provide what you need rapidly, and then for longer term planning, you go with the larger suppliers. But that's always been a challenge for supply chain, I think.
Yeah, like you know, phased approach. Yeah, maybe you start off with a survey you send them,
Yeah.
you know, looking at their certifications, things like that, and then, you know, once you're at this more like scale up stage, doing an
Yeah.
on-site audit. Yeah, like that
Yeah. But the
idea.
qualification starts earlier on. For me, I recommend that because you can assess your suppliers right away, right? So
Right. Yeah. And then, you know, have your options, and like, as Adam alluded to, getting quotes. So, you know, make that, you know, obviously a part of it, you know, for the different quantities. You know, obviously maybe they, you know, check all the boxes, but a couple of them check all the boxes, then you can come down to, you know, costs and what the comparisons are there. So we got another question from LinkedIn, which is, you know, are there any logistics concerns for, you know, I believe they mean like for suppliers, for working with suppliers from other parts of the world. So, you know, in Asia or Europe, any special considerations when working with these things to avoid or look out for?
customs, right? The challenge of getting through customs sometimes when you work with suppliers outside the country, or how far do you go from a standpoint of the global controls, sanctions of other countries? How do you work with that if they're a supplier of a supplier? I mean, those things can be challenging.
Yeah, really good point. My previous role, we were sourcing gelatin, and only to find out, you know, bovine gelatin, anything bovine related, is almost impossible to get across borders because of, you know, the contagious diseases that can come in bovine products. So, you know, you might have to use a different animal source because of some of these regulations, you know, porcine or fish instead. So really glad you brought that up. Awesome. So, you know, how we actually had a question, this was submitted from our cohort. You know, how can you consistently manage several components from various suppliers to ensure regulatory approval or satisfaction with this? Adam, Alexander, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think communication is the most important thing as you're navigating various suppliers and a number of different components. We've touched on the change control process as well, just maintaining that part traceability to keep things organized. I think rev control comes to mind when you're thinking about specifications or engineering drawings. I think that just helps communicate the latest design to suppliers, and they can keep that in their system as well. So all the way back to the state of prototyping, I think at the concept level, sometimes we may have the flexibility outside the change control process really early on. But I think concept revisions really do help communicate with your suppliers what you're looking for, and making sure that both parties are aligned on the latest components that you're asking for, and then it just makes a much easier transition into your DMR and eventually your DHF as well with regulatory approval long term.
Oh, thanks, Adam. And I think really wraps up well, our discussion on suppliers. And so, yeah, in summary, hope that, do your diligence on many different suppliers, and look at your options, consider things like customs. And so now, last 10 minutes, I want to move into some thoughts around working with CMOs or contract manufacturing organizations. So, many of our startups in our cohort are pretty early stage, probably doing, a lot of their manufacturing in-house through various processes. And letting go of this critical step to outsiders can sometimes feel scary. So when is the right time to transfer this manufacturing process to a CMO, or does it really depend? So Carolyn, love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, this is a tough one, I think, for everyone. For smaller scale, CMO, sooner the better, and so that both parties can learn and develop together. For larger high scale volume CMO, they probably would expect the CMO to have processes that are very well defined before they even would consider going with that CMO. But I think it's important to have the trust, right? So hopefully it's not scary. So developing that relationship, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree.
that's a tough one.
Making sure there's trust there. And yeah, I'm sure also depends on the complexity of the process involved in all these stages. So Sonia, I'd love to hear from you what some advantages, disadvantages, of working with a CMO versus keeping manufacturing internal. And can you avoid some of these potential pitfalls with the right planning?
So I guess my experience in this was from when I was working on my own company, and I think it's important to find a manufacturer that can make everything that you're envisioning at first, because I think that's just kind of like where you can learn the most amount of knowledge. And then later, if you feel the need to separate it, that's kind of like what I would think to do, just because like you want to kind of get the most value from one person instead of kind of keeping track of multiple things. But there's always risk, right? Like risk of the one that can do more things not wanting to work with you, kind of like what Carolyn said. And then the risk on the other side is like working with so many suppliers when you're so small yourself, can be really overwhelming. So I think a balance of balancing that, like planning for a future, but also kind of realizing where you can get the most value now is like kind of what I would do.
Yeah, good advice. See, who can handle as much as possible in-house, hopefully for the right price. But yeah, trying to limit the number of relationships you're trying to tackle at once. So, when looking at these CMOs, many of them like to publicize their different, regulations, certifications that they abide by. So, how do you ensure that you're compliant when you work with a CMO? And what are some examples of certifications that you should look for? So maybe Adam Alexander, you want to take this one?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the certifications often are publicized to showcase whether they have the ability to take ownership of the design in the DHF. So things like ISO 9001, do they have a quality control system? Are they able to maintain design controls? I think looking at that and asking the right questions on what they're capable of is important. And then also considering what are your needs from the CMO, whether it's design, manufacturing, supply chain, or regulatory, just assessing what do you need and what do they offer is where I would focus and consider.
Yeah, really helpful. I think, people just want to look for that ISO 13485, but there's so much more to it than that. Really, the broad context of this. Carolyn or Adam Wentworth, you want to add on to either of these questions at all around, you know, choosing CMOs and, you know, maybe working with one versus multiple, experience with that?
Is that Adam?
Either one of you take it. You want to start out, Carolyn?
Go ahead, Carolyn.
Go ahead. I'm so sorry.
I think it depends. If you have some complex products, you might not be able to get away with just a single supplier. But I like the point made before about working with a small versus a big one. You know, if it's the first one you're working with a smaller supplier, they may have that flexibility that you really want to, as you learn and they learn, to make those accommodations, because you need them, but they also need you too. So I think that's the point I would say.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just not feasible with, especially if it's a specialized technology, right? If you have sensors, for example, in your devices, it's difficult. Sometimes you just have to accept that risk and manage it through inventory and innovation of your future products, so you don't put your business at risk.
Important things to think through. It's such a, you know, major component to your success if you're working with the CMO. So ensuring that's going to proceed well throughout the future is quite important. So we had a cohort submitted question, which was, we manufacture today in Shenzhen, China, due to expediency and a robust supply chain. With all the geopolitical uncertainty facing the economy, what are some pros and cons of working with China or, you know, other, you know, maybe uncertain economic market countries? Who wants to take this one, if anyone has experience with this?
I mean, we work with China, especially with molding components. The advantage of working with China, for example, is price and sometimes lead times. Although they're outside the country, they're quick turnaround. Sometimes it makes it attractive, especially when you need feedback immediately during your development. They work with you. At least that's my experience with a company we work with. So I can only speak to that experience.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges sometimes is the language barrier, obviously, but that can easily be overcome. There's that tipping point, right, in the development cycle, that there's always challenges. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like not insurmountable, but yeah, definitely consider, you know, the big picture of it all. Great. So I guess last question I want to touch on is, you know, if you do decide to keep processes internal, you know, what sorts of controls you should be putting in place for this. So Adam Alexander, maybe you can speak to this. You know, if you're doing internal manufacturing, you know, how would you go about setting this up in the right way? Are there certain regulations that you would need to consider when setting up a manufacturing facility of your own?
Yeah, it depends on the process, but I think a lot of times looking at process validations is where you would spend quite a bit of time. If the process has, you know, parameters that can vary throughout and over time, you look at the high and low ends and then your nominal settings. So you're really challenging the spectrum that the process may be exposing to the components or end results. So considering the different test methods to validating the process is also important. So making sure you have a validated test method is important, and then the documentation that's related to that. You know, making sure you have the traceability and the kind of the DHF and design control procedures in place that really articulate how you've you know, developed this process and why you feel it's repeatable and reliable.
Yeah, it's a great answer. It's something I always wondered when I was in a startup. I always thought there were like very firm guidelines. You need to do this, set this up in this way, put this in a clean room of this, ISO grade, but like, it's, as you said, it's up to you to determine what the risks are for each component of your process and how to manage that. And so with that, Carolyn, would love to hear from you. You've worked a lot with clean room processes. So, what types of processes are typically used in a clean room environment? And, does this depend on how the device is going to be used, like an implantable versus skin contact? Are there certain questions you should ask to determine where it should be manufactured?
Yeah, like you said, it's really based on the device, right? If it's a sterile device, I would imagine most of your manufacturing processes will be in the clean room, and those that cannot, absolutely not going to be in the clean room due to, for whatever reason, contaminants and so forth. Like Adam was saying, you have to validate those cleaning processes before you bring subsequent processes in the clean room. So it really, the questions we ask really is primarily the device, and then also the impact to the other, the impact to the facility, and sometimes the personnel, right? So it's, but most of them can be done outside the clean room. I think sometimes we go overboard and put things in the clean room, but mostly it's depending on the control you must put in that device, the cleanliness.
I think that's a great note to end it on, is, putting the right controls in place, taking things responsibly, especially when you're having devices that are going to be in contact with patients, and, making sure that everything is manufactured in a reasonable way, from beginning to end, so that the patient, the surgeon, clinician that's working with this has the best possible experience with your product. Ultimately, that's what we're going to do, is change and improve patient lives. And so all of these processes are just, the means to the end to get to that. And so always, consider all of your options, and, try to be creative in working toward this. So with that, I want to thank our four amazing panelists today. So both Adam Squared, Carolyn, Sonia, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom with the cohort. I also want to share with, before we log off, the live portion. For those of you in LinkedIn, thank you so much for joining. Also wanted to plug that we just announced today our 10 finalists that are going to be pitching at the MedTech conference, hosted by AdvaMed, up in Toronto in a few weeks. So congratulations to those 10 companies. So for our early stage grand prize award, we've got BrainSpace, Flow Medical, Juniper Biomedical, Neurobionics, and Semai. So congratulations to those 5 companies. They are going to be pitching for a grand prize of $350,000 non-dilutive funding. The rest will receive $25,000 non-dilutive funding. And then our execution prize finalists, so AccurKardia, Akina, ICE Neurosystems, Sonahil, and Vinova. Congratulations to the 5 of you as well. Really looking forward to seeing your final pitches. It's been a pleasure working with all the companies in our cohort as we, wrap up the end of our MTI program. Hope that everyone joining in live today learned something from these panelists, and their wisdom inspired them to, put the right controls in place, but also, be creative, and, especially when it comes to new manufacturing technologies like 3D printing, and how this might get you a great product. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to our panel.